The call came in at 2:47 in the morning, and nobody in the Hargrove County Regional Hospital expected it to matter much. A military transport had requested emergency clearance on the trauma bay. Delta Force. 2 wounded, 1 stable, 1 not. The not stable one had already flatlined twice in the air and been brought back both times by a flight medic who, by the time they landed, looked like he'd aged 10 years in 90 minutes. The ER charge nurse that night was a woman named Sylvie. She was 31 years old, 5'4", with a plain face and the kind of quiet that people in hospitals mistake for timidity. She wore no makeup on night shifts. Her badge photo looked like someone who'd been asked to smile and declined. She had been at Hargrove for 14 months, transferred in from a small clinic in Billings without much fanfare, without any references anyone could verify easily, and without any of the war stories the other nurses traded over bad coffee in the break room. What Sylvie did have was a habit of showing up early, leaving late, and never once raising her voice. The nurses who didn't like her, and there were a few, called her ghost. Not to her face. They meant it as an insult. She was too quiet, too still, too unbothered by the things that were supposed to bother people. She never flinched at blood, never looked rattled in a code, never gossiped, never vented, never cried in the supply closet the way almost everyone did eventually. The nurses who did like her couldn't quite explain why. There was just something about the way she moved in a crisis. Slower than you'd expect. Deliberate. Like she'd already run through every scenario in her head before the emergency even arrived. The transport gurney came through the bay doors at 2:52, and Sylvie was already gloved. His name, according to the field report that preceded him by 30 seconds, was Staff Sergeant Cole Maddox. 29 years old, 2 tours in Syria, 1 in West Africa, currently attached to a classified unit out of Fort Bragg. The field report ended there. Everything after his blood type was redacted. The flight medic, a young man named Pruett, who still had blood on the collar of his flight suit, relayed what he knew in the compressed language of combat medicine. VSS upon extraction. BP tanked around hour 2. We got him back twice. Pupils equal and reactive. No apparent trauma, no GSW, no blast injury, no fractures we could find. He just started shutting down. Dr. Raymond Achabe, the attending on duty, took the report without looking up from the chart he was already pulling. He was a capable physician, 12 years in emergency medicine, and he had the particular confidence of someone who had seen enough that very little surprised him anymore. Talk screen, he said. Full panel. Cardiac workup. Get me a CT head. Already ordered, Sylvie said. Achabe glanced at her. Just a glance, the kind that wasn't quite acknowledgement. Cole Maddox lay on the gurney with his hands folded across his chest. That was the thing Sylvie noticed first. The hands. Soldiers brought in from combat zones were usually restrained in transport or sedated or both. Cole's hands were free, and they were folded deliberately, like a man at rest, like a man who had chosen this. His eyes were closed. His breathing was shallow but present. Every monitor they attached confirmed what Pruett had said. No physical cause. His heart was beating. His brain was lit. His body was simply refusing in some deep and cellular way to continue. Sir, one of the nurses said loudly near his ear. Sir, can you hear me? Nothing. Cole Maddox, can you open your eyes for me? Nothing. Achabe ordered a neurology consult. Neurology called down 15 minutes later with their preliminary read. No bleed, no stroke, no tumor. Nothing structural to explain the presentation. They wanted an MRI. Achabe agreed. The orderlies began prepping for transport to imaging. It was during those minutes, while the room reorganized itself around the logistics of moving an unresponsive man through hospital corridors, that Sylvie stayed at the bedside. She was charting, or she looked like she was charting. Her eyes were on the tablet in her hand, but her attention was on Cole Maddox's hands. The right hand was doing something. It was faint enough that it could have been involuntary. A tremor, a reflex. But Sylvie had spent enough time in enough places to know such a difference between a body misfiring and a body communicating. His index finger was tapping. Not randomly. There was a rhythm to it. Short, long. Short, short. A pause. Long. Short. She set down the tablet very carefully. She watched for another 45 seconds, not moving, not reacting, keeping her face completely neutral. The rhythm continued. It wasn't Morse. She checked that first. It was something older. Something that had been taught to American PBOs during the Korean War and never entirely forgotten by the men trained to fear capture. Tap code, 5x5 grid. Knock to communicate through walls, through solitary confinement, through the silence of cells where no other language was permitted. He was spelling something. She pulled a pen from her pocket and began writing letters on the back of her glove, translating as she went. It took her 3 full repetitions of the sequence before she had it. WATCH. Not a word with meaning in isolation. Not in this context. A call sign. She was almost certain of it. "We're ready to move," one of the orderlies said. "Give me a minute," Sylvie said. "Dr. Achibi wants 1 minute." The orderly stopped. There was something in her voice that made people stop when she used it. She didn't raise it. She didn't threaten. It was simply a voice that had said things that mattered in places where mattering was the difference. And the body remembered that even when the brain didn't fully understand it. She leaned down close to Cole Maddox's ear. The room was noisy. Monitors, voices, the ambient sound of a hospital at 3 a.m, and she kept her voice below all of it. "Watchman," she said quietly. "You're clear." She'd guessed at the full call sign, taken the fragment he'd given and made an inference. It was the kind of inference that had a 50% chance of meaning nothing, and a 50% chance of meaning everything. Cole Maddox's right hand went still. Then, slowly, his left hand unclenched. His blood pressure, which had been hovering at a level that made the monitors anxious, began to climb. Sylvie straightened up. She picked up her tablet. She went back to charting. Achibi came back into the bay 12 minutes later with the neurology attending and found Cole Maddox's vitals stabilizing in a way that nothing they had done had caused. He stood at the foot of the gurney for a moment, looking at the numbers, and then he looked at Sylvie. "What happened?" he said. "He started responding about 10 minutes ago," she said. "Gradual improvement." Achi looked at the chart. He looked at Cole. He looked at Sylvie. "What did you do?" he asked. "I talked to him," she said. The neurology attending, Dr. Presha Malone, was a woman in her mid-40s who had once written a paper on psychogenic non-epileptic events and considered herself the most qualified person in any room to speak on the subject of minds that turned against their bodies. She had been skeptical when Achi called her down, and she was still skeptical now, but the numbers were the numbers. "Psychogenic shutdown," she said quietly, mostly to herself. His nervous system decided the threat was unsurvivable and initiated controlled withdrawal. "He's Delta Force," the flight medic Pruitt said from the doorway. He'd refused to leave. "They trained for this. Not to die, exactly. But to go somewhere else. To wait. To wait for what?" Achibi asked. Pruitt shook his head. He didn't have the clearance to answer that. Sylvie said nothing. She continued charting. By 4 a.m, Cole Maddox was breathing on his own with full depth. By 4:30, his eyes were open. They were gray, she noticed, and very calm. The calm of someone who had gone somewhere very dark and returned from it without being surprised by either the going or the coming back. He looked at the ceiling for a while. Then he looked at the people around him, doing the quiet inventory of a man assessing his environment for threat. His gaze moved past Achibi, past Dr. Malone, past the nurse checking his IV, and settled on Sylvie. He studied her for a moment. "You have Siri training," he said. His voice was rough from hours of disuse, but it was steady. Survival, evasion, resistance, escape, the program that taught tap code. "Go back to sleep, Sergeant Maddox," Sylvie said, without looking up from her chart. "That's not an answer," she agreed. "It's not." She finished the line she was writing and turned the page. He watched her for another long moment. Then he turned his eyes back to the ceiling. "Thank you," he said. She didn't respond to that either, but her pen for just a fraction of a second went still. The day shift came on at 7, and with it came 2 men in civilian clothes who were not civilians. They arrived at the nurse's station with credentials Sylvie recognized as legitimate and a manner she recognized as the particular politeness of federal authority. Perfectly courteous, not open to negotiation. One of them was tall with a neat dark beard and introduced himself as Agent Farrell. The other was shorter, older, with the compressed watchfulness of a man who had spent decades learning not to show what he was thinking. He didn't introduce himself at all. They wanted to speak with the staff who had attended Cole Maddox overnight. They were especially interested, Agent Farrell said pleasantly, in any unusual interventions. Sylvie was at the end of her shift, changing out of her scrubs in the staff locker room, when the day charge nurse came to find her. "There are 2 men asking for you," she said. Her name was Deneen, and she had the look of someone delivering news she didn't understand but found slightly exciting. "I know," Sylvie said. She pulled on her jacket. She had already known this was coming. She'd had roughly 3 hours to decide how she was going to handle it, and she had a plan. The way she always had a plan, the way having a plan had once been the difference between going home and not going home. She walked to the nurse's station. Farrell and the older man were waiting. "Monsieur Oran," Farrell said. "Nurse Oran," she said, mildly. A small correction, the kind that people either didn't notice or noticed very much. Farrell smiled. "Of course. We'd like to ask you about your treatment of staff, Sergeant Maddox. My charting is complete," she said. "You're welcome to request the records through the hospital administrator. We're more interested in the intervention you performed around 3:20 this morning," Farrell said. "The nursing staff we've spoken to described a verbal interaction that seems to have preceded the patient's recovery." "I talked to him," Sylvie said. "I told him where he was. Patients sometimes need orientation." The older man, who had not yet spoken, looked at her with the patient attention of someone who had conducted this kind of conversation a great many times and understood that what mattered was not what was said but what was not said. "Tap code," he said. Not a question, a placement. He was setting the piece on the board and watching to see how she responded. Sylvie met his eyes. His were pale blue and very still. "I don't know what that is," she said. The older man nodded slowly. The nod of someone who has just received the answer they expected, in the form they expected. "We appreciate your time," Farrell said. They left. Sylvie stood at the nurse's station for a moment after they were gone. Deneen was hovering nearby with a look on her face that was 90% curiosity and 10% concern. "What was that about?" Deneen asked. "Paperwork," Sylvie said. She picked up her bag and walked toward the exit. She was in the parking lot, the early Montana morning, coming in cold and pale over the mountains to the east, when she heard footsteps behind her. She didn't reach for anything. She didn't turn. She just stopped walking. "You know," said Cole Maddox's voice. "Most people, when they see 2 federal agents, go home and don't sleep for a week." She turned around. He was in a hospital gown and a borrowed fleece jacket, walking on his own power, which he absolutely should not have been doing, given that 12 hours ago, his body had been in the process of shutting itself down. He had an IV line still taped to the back of his left hand and the general look of a man who had discharged himself by simply getting up and walking out, which, she suspected, was exactly what he had done. "You shouldn't be out of bed," she said. "I'm aware." He stopped a few feet away and looked at her the way he had looked at her in the bay, that quiet, systematic assessment. 12 years. She didn't answer. "That's how long it's been since I've met a civilian who knows tap code well enough to catch it live and translate in real time." He paused. 12 years ago, at a JPRA briefing in Bethesda, there was a signals analyst from DIA who could do it. She left the intelligence community 6 years later. "I never met anyone who could do it after that." The wind came down off the mountains, cold and sharp. "I'm going to be late for my bus," Sylvie said. Her name was redacted in every document I ever had access to, Cole continued, as though she hadn't spoken. "She went under about 4 different cover identities before she left. Nobody I know has been able to track her since." He tilted his head. "You went to a lot of trouble to disappear." Sylvie looked at him for a long moment. "Go back inside, Sergeant Maddox," she said, "before you fall down in a hospital parking lot and I have to document it." Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. Something more like recognition, the particular acknowledgement of one person who has learned to survive in silence, meeting another. "I'd like to know how you did it," he said. "The call sign. Watchman is a Tier 1 designation. It's not in any file that a civilian could access." "I guessed," she said. "You guessed. You gave me enough letters. The rest was inference." He was quiet for a moment. The monitors of the hospital hummed behind him. A car turned into the lot, headlights sweeping across them both, and Sylvie didn't move, didn't turn her face away, didn't do anything that would look like hiding. "That's a hell of an inference," Cole said. "I've made worse bets," she said. She turned and kept walking. She made it almost to the bus stop at the edge of the hospital access road before she heard him call after her, his voice carrying across the quiet of early morning. "Oran," a pause. "Thank you. For real." She didn't stop walking, but she heard it, and she let herself, in the privacy of a parking lot at 6:45 in the morning with no one watching, close her eyes for exactly 1 second. She'd spent 6 years becoming a person no one looked at twice, a name that didn't ring bells, a face that blended into the background of any room. She had given up a great many things to get here. Titles, clearances, the particular identity that came with being very good at a very specific and very dangerous kind of work. She had given them all up carefully and deliberately and without regret. But some things she had learned you couldn't give up entirely. Some knowledge was written too deep. Some instincts were load-bearing. Pull them out, and the whole structure came down. She had known what Cole Maddox's finger was saying the moment she saw it, not because she was trying to remember, because she had never, in any meaningful sense, forgotten. The bus came at 6:53. She got on. She found a seat by the window and watched the mountains go past as the town woke up around them, the light coming in gold and gradual over the peaks. She thought about what Farrell and the older man had not said. She thought about how much they already knew and how much they were still inferring. She thought about the particular sound of Cole Maddox's voice, saying thank you for real in the cold of a parking lot at dawn, with an IV still taped to his hand. She thought about Bethesda, about a briefing room with fluorescent lights and bad coffee, and 12 men in uniform who had looked at her with the particular skepticism that rooms full of operators reserved for signals people. About the year that came after, and the year after that, and the file that bore her old name, and the clearance she no longer carried. The bus stopped at her corner. She got off. She walked the 2 blocks to her apartment, unlocked the door, went inside. On the kitchen counter was the same mug she used every morning, the same coffee maker, the same view of the same street she had chosen, because it had 3 exits and good sightlines and neighbors who kept to themselves. She put the kettle on. She sat down at the kitchen table. She took out the piece of paper she'd kept from the night before. Not her glove. She'd disposed of that through proper waste protocols, but a notation she'd made for herself in the small hours when she was waiting for the CT results to come back. She unfolded it and looked at what she'd written. WATCH. She had been right about the rest. She had not guessed so much as remembered. Watchman had been a name she had encountered once, in a document that no longer existed in any archive she had access to, in a context that had never been explained to her. She had filed it the way she filed everything. Not in any system, not in any notation, just in the part of her mind that kept what it was given and did not let go. That was the thing about the life she had lived before. It made you into a particular kind of container. You held things without knowing why. You held them for years. And then one morning at 3 a.m. in a trauma bay in Montana, a man's finger spelled out 4 letters, and the thing you had been holding for 7 years turned out to be the exact thing needed. She folded the paper and held it for a moment. Then she got up, crossed to the stove, turned on the burner, and held the paper over it until it caught. She watched it burn down to nothing over the sink. The kettle began to whistle. She poured her coffee. She stood at the window and drank it while the street below went from empty to beginning. A dog walker, a woman in scrubs coming off the overnight from somewhere, a delivery truck making its first round. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Unknown number. Text message. 3 words. We should talk. She looked at the message for a long time. Then she set the phone face down on the counter and finished her coffee. She already knew she would answer. Not because she had to. Not because anyone was compelling her. But because some things, once woken up, did not go easily back to sleep. Because the part of her that had translated tap code at 3 a.m. was the same part that had chosen this apartment for its sightlines. And that part did not believe in coincidences. And that part suspected that Cole Maddox, showing up in her trauma bay in the middle of the night, was not In the fullest sense of the word, an accident. She had built a very quiet life. She had built it on purpose, with care, and she had been proud of how ordinary it looked from the outside. But she had built it out of skills that were not ordinary. And skills, she knew better than most, had a way of mattering precisely at the moment. You had most convinced yourself they were behind you. She picked up the phone. She typed 2 letters. Okay, she sent it. She rinsed her mug in the sink, set it on the drying rack, and went to bed. She slept the way she always slept, lightly, efficiently, without dreams, with one part of her mind always keeping watch. Outside, the morning came fully into itself, gold and cold and enormous over the Montana mountains, the way mornings do when they don't yet know what the day is going to ask of the people waking into them. Sylvie Orens slept. And for the first time in 6 years, the silence of her apartment felt not like concealment, but like the breath before something begins.